So let's just start. I'm going to give some introductory remarks about Marx um, before we turn to the text. Uh, so if you're interested in further reading, I'll recommend stuff along the way that you can pick up and read at your leisure. Like this tome, Marx. I think I included an excerpt, but this is a biography that is a very good one by Robert Payne. I don't know if it's still in print. It's published in 1968, but you can get a real feel for Marx as a person and just the texture of his life. Because, I mean, maybe I should say why I was interested in communism. I think as a high schooler, I always instinctively knew it was evil. There was um, two Czech sisters on my soccer team who had come from the Czech Republic, and their dad was our coach, and they he had been forced to he was conscripted into the Red Army. He hated communism. We had won a state tournament once, and they put a red five-pointed red star on to indicate the victory, and their dad colored all of them with Sharpie to get that off the jerseys. So I instinctively sympathized with them. And then I remember when I got to college, there was a student there in a politics class or something. We got to talking, and he was talking about how good communism was in theory, and that, some bad things happened in practice, but in theory, it was good. And as, an 18-year-old, I did not agree with this, but I didn't really know why, because to me at the time seemed kind of hard to argue with, well, the theory is good, the brotherhood of man. How could you not think that's a good goal or a good ideal? But I knew somewhere deep down that it was wrong, and I couldn't articulate why. So anyways, I didn't really get to study it in college at all because there was no course offerings on communism whatsoever or on Marx, and I studied the classics. And then it wasn't until graduate school that I got to take a course on Russian history with a fantastic professor at the Institute of World Politics in Washington, D.C. And it was a Polish professor who had, ties to family members who had been killed. And I mean, he really brilliant historian, and he's the one who introduced me to the real history of communism. And that was where I kind of got interested in the theory and the practice of communism. And I would say therein lies the key. It's the theory and the practice. And so we'll flesh that out over the course of this course. So back to some biographical information on Karl Marx. Marx, this biographer had said, was considered an infallible oracle worshipped by the communists. He drank heavily. He seduced his maid and fathered an illegitimate child. He lived way beyond his means. He mooched off of his widowed mother and his longtime friend, Friedrich Engels. He was a police informant, and he was a cause of tremendous suffering for his family and friends. This was kind of the way that this biographer introduces Marx. And I think overall, this biographer is actually pretty balanced. Um, he was born in Trier. It was a very Catholic city in the Rhine province of Prussia in 1818 to Jewish parents. He was wealthy. He had servants. His father was a lawyer, and his ancestors had all been rabbis. And his father was the first to not be a rabbi. He converted to evangelical Christianity at a time when the government was kind of cracking down on Jews, and they weren't really practicing. So the dad and all of the kids converted, and then Marx's mother converted when her father passed away. His father, Heinrich Marx, was on the watch list of the Prussian state because he had outspoken liberal views. He was a man of the Enlightenment. He knew Voltaire and Rousseau by heart. And I think that this had an impact on the formation of Marx's imagination. At age 12, Marx entered what had formerly been a Jesuit gymnasium for high school. And he was taught by a liberal, um, Enlightenment influenced professor. He was bad at math and history, but he was good in Greek and Latin and German, and he had a classical education. He did later claim to have invented a new form of differential calculus, but that was a fabrication. He was intelligent, his professor said, but nothing particularly special. He bullied his younger sisters, but he was good friends with his older sister. He tormented his teachers, who one biographer said were long-suffering. And he had a sharp tongue, so he was not very popular with his schoolmates. This professor, the one who had been influenced by the Enlightenment, was fond of him and regarded him as rather unruly but imaginative, but he was otherwise quite ordinary. So Marx actually first learned about socialism from his future father-in-law, um, who was a learned aristocrat, which is interesting because it was the aristocratic class in both the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution that really brought about these revolutions. So it's interesting that that is where Marx first came across these ideas. He would go on these long strolls with his father-in-law, who would talk to him about the classics, about Homer, about Shakespeare, and then about Saint-Simon, who was a socialist, and that was kind of where Marx first came across these ideas, as well as Lessing, Goethe, Schiller, the German Romantics. And these discussions, according to some biographers, were very influential on Marx's mind. And I think they were. I think we'll see that. But this was a real introduction to the classics for him. And these chats kind of inspired him to want to dedicate his life to some high and noble cause. And there's evidence of this in the essays that he wrote for his exit examinations from the high school. I think he was only 16 when he wrote them, but for me, they're so telling. You should go and read them. I'll try to upload them. I don't think I included them in the syllabus. But in one of the examinations, he's asked about choosing a profession. I forget what the topic is, but it has something to do with choosing your profession, your career. And he takes this very seriously in the essay, and he says that it is something that merits great consideration. It is an incredibly weighty decision, and that the profession you choose should be one that can benefit the greatest number of people and bring the greatest happiness. So there's already this kind of romantic and also utilitarian idea about both happiness and purpose in life, and that you kind of can see where this modern idea that so many people have tied to careers sort of originated, I think, within the Romantic era, because Marx was very much steeped within the Romantic period and also the Enlightenment period. So these were two major influences on his imagination and on his thinking. And you can see that in these essays. And of course, I mean, the irony of him wanting to help the greatest number of people when he ushered in cataclysmic disaster that is of a magnitude that's inconceivable. Okay, so any questions so far before I just blaze on through? I'm just trying to give an introductory, sort of give some of the texture to Marx's life and person before we jump into the text. And we will come back to this because I did assign part of his part of the biography that I've got here. Any questions right now?
When their family converted to Christianity, I mean, does he speak about that as a high school kid, or is it what is there any, I know later in life he obviously rejected it completely, but
Yeah, he started to reject it in his early 20s, but there's actually in one of his exit examinations, one of the essays had to do with communion with Christ, and he wrote about that. And the professor mentioned that it was a good, logically progressing argument, but that he fails to actually answer the question that's asked. And so he kind of gives he's he says what he needs to about Christianity in this essay. There's no evidence that he's become an atheist or anything, or that he's rejected it, but he was probably writing what was expected of him, especially at the time. And so I don't think we have a whole lot about his views, but his dad was very influential on his thinking. And his dad was they went to church every Sunday, but his dad was not really a believer. I think he converted for political reasons so that he wouldn't be left out of employment. But they weren't a very devout family. I think what people have said about the dad in particular was that he was very tied to these Enlightenment ideas, and he was really a child of the Enlightenment. So I have to believe that Marx was kind of the same persuasion. And I mean, he lost his faith so quickly that there must not have been much there, is my understanding. Anybody else have any other questions? I can try to answer. So then Marx went off to law school for 2 semesters, the University of Bonn. That was where the drinking, the philandering, spending his parents' money, he got into a duel. It was crazy there. Um, there was a lot of aristocrats there, and things just were out of hand at this school. So then his dad wrote petition or whatever was needed, and he ended up transferring to the University of Berlin, which was a very studious institution. He nearly killed himself studying round the clock, burning the midnight oil. Um, but at these 2 institutions, he was writing a lot of poetry. And I think his first aspiration had actually been to be a poet. And many biographers ignore this aspect of Marx's corpus. But I think that the key to his imagination is in his poetry. Um, have any of you read Paul Kengore's book, The Devil and Karl Marx? It's very
yeah.
good. Yeah, I recommend that one. It's a good read. He draws attention to this poetry, but it really reveals Marx's cast of mind. Um, and he treated himself very seriously as a poet. That's what he wanted to do. His first published writings were 2 ballads that were printed in a Berlin literary magazine in 1841 under the title Savage Songs. And one is called, there's some different translations. The Player is the translation I've seen most common, but I think The Violinist might be another one. And Nocturnal Love is the second ballad that was published. The Violinist or The Player is, I again recommend you read these 2 poems. I can't remember if they're in here or not, but I can publish them in the documents. The Player is about this wild violinist who is tearing his bow to shreds with how violently he's playing. And the interlocutor is asking him, why do you play like this with the gift that God has given you? And he kind of mocks God, and he says, do you see this sword? The Prince of Darkness sold it to me. So it's really this dark meditation on evil and on the devil. Um, and then the other ballad, Nocturnal Love, is about a suicide pact between 2 lovers who are uh, dying in each other's arms as they watch the world burn. And it's this satanic and utter rejection of the world. And so these are his first published writings. I mean, it's from the mind of a disturbed individual who could write these, but at the same time, they are within the Romantic tradition. There's this kind of dark, the melancholic brooding. If you took my course on Rousseau, you know exactly what this is about. It goes even farther than that, though. But there is something that is still within the romantic cast of mind here. And the nocturnal love poem is especially disturbing because of Marx's three daughters, two of them ended up committing suicide. So these are all just interesting, I think, parts of Marx's life and cast of mind that can kind of help us piece the man together. And it makes it all the more surprising that his writings have become, I mean, they became so influential. So, any questions before I go on? Okay. So then at a certain point, Marx abandons poetry as his main interest. There was a brief interlude when he tried his hand at playwriting, but he soon found his home in philosophy. And so something interesting throughout all of this was his relationship with his father, who would write to him and would beg him to get his life together, to stop philandering, to consider his honor, to stop drinking, to beg him to stop spending so much money that he and Marx's mother could not support his lifestyle. I mean, he was spending more than the average wealthy person was spending per month. And his dad was just pleading with him to just get it together and to stop. Um, and was also pleading with him to remember this woman, Jenny, who he was secretly engaged to. And she was like waiting for him to get a job and get his life together. And he was off the university just going wild. So there's a lot of letters that have survived from the dad, but many of Marx's letters to his dad did not survive. Although there is a very interesting one that has survived that was written just before Marx's dad dies, in which Marx says, I mean, it's a long letter and it was written again, burning the midnight oil. He was up until 2 or 3 in the morning writing this kind of unhinged letter. And he complains to his dad, quote, "A deep unrest has mastered me, and I shall not be able to lay the specters that haunt me until I am in your dear presence." And so it's odd that he says this because he didn't have a great relationship with his dad. His dad died not long after this. Although I want to quote what the dad responded to this letter. He sat on it for a few weeks until he could finally put something together. And the dad writes back to Marx, "God help us," with triple exclamation marks. "Complete disorder, stupid wandering through all branches of knowledge, stupid brooding over melancholy oil lamps, going to seed in a scholastic dressing gown and unkempt hair as a change from going to seed with a glass of beer." And he goes on. It's great. His dad is really unhappy with his son, who has squandered away everything. And the parents, I mean, they gave him so much, and they, by the end, had very little money left. And Marx continued to hit up his poor widowed mother for money. So his dad dies. He did not go to the funeral. And I think we should turn to the text, actually. So this will segue into the text, because what struck me about this interesting letter is that he's telling his dad that he shall not be able to lay the specters that haunt me. And how does he open the Communist Manifesto? And this will actually get to the point about a translation. Unfortunately, I assigned a communist editor slash translator. But, this is the one I have that's annotated. So anyways, in my translation, it says, "A specter is stalking Europe, the specter of communism." However, other translations, which are better, translate it thus: "A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. All powers of old Europe have entered into a holy alliance to exorcise this specter." So, I mean, they use the religious term. I'm sorry, Marx uses the religious term exercise. And he talks about a haunting specter. I mean, it's very troubling. This is the preamble to the Communist Manifesto. So I'll open up
It's
for
also very in
discussion.
keeping with the sorry. It's also very in keeping with the romantic theme of it. Just that gothic, overwrought melodrama.
Yeah. And he's writing this at a time when communism really is not a force on the scene yet. But he speaks as if it is. I mean, he's right that that these powers of old Europe are aware. But when he says communism is already acknowledged by all European powers to be a power too, it was not, I mean, really very powerful at this time. This is really the beginning.
Well, a word on that second translation that you gave about, specters haunting Europe. Um, the text that you assigned, you said it was from like basically a communist sympathizer.
I don't know if she is or not, but I have my suspicions. Or
Well,
he, who is it? I'm not sure. Probably
this particular edition I picked up from, I think it's a Penguin Random House thing. They have that version, that second version that you read, and the dude who translated it most definitely was a communist. There's a note on the text saying it was translated by a guy named Samuel Moore, and this says he was an old friend of Engels, and
Mm.
he was tapped by Engels to translate the second edition of the German version into English, and
And
that
what's his translation?
a specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. All the powers of old Europe have entered into a holy alliance to exorcise this specter. Pope and Tsar, Metternich and Guizot, French radicals, and German police spies.
Yeah, that's the version that the Marxist.org has on their website. Because
Yeah,
I was
so
curious. And they use the term exercise. So that religious language is there.
yeah,
That's
and
interesting.
so I find it I just thought it was kind of noteworthy, you made the side that the version that you were using that's annotated was potentially by a commie and not as great, and then you go and give the give the other version, which is most definitely by a commie, being good friends with Engels and was the approved version from Engels. um
Yeah, there's kind of a different sense there. I mean, when you've got those religious words, haunting Europe, a holy alliance to exorcise this specter, it kind of gives a different sort of feel. Okay, but I don't know. This was the copy I got in whenever, and when you've got all your margin notes written, it's just the copy that you'll have forever. So be careful what you choose. It will never leave you. Actually, when we evacuated for the fires, some of the things I grabbed were these cheap copies of books that I had annotated because the only thing that's irreplaceable, really. All right. So let's look at the opening lines here. Bourgeois and proletarians. The history of all society hitherto is the history of class struggles. That's the subhead to the title of this part of the pamphlet. So let me just read this first paragraph. Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in short, oppressor and oppressed, situated in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open conflict. A fight that each time ended in a revolutionary transformation of the entire society, or in the common ruin of the contending classes. So Marx is doing here I mean, these opening lines really recall the opening lines of Rousseau's Social Contract. Rousseau was writing in the middle of the 18th century, about a century before Marx. And Rousseau is the quintessential romantic thinker. He was a social contract thinker. And I mean, he I think, was even more influential on modernity than Marx. I think Marx actually would not have even been possible without Rousseau and the Romantic movement that preceded him. But this was the tactic that Rousseau used in the social contract. He says, man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains. And so, just like that, with one fell swoop, you have the political theorist who has given an entirely revised account of all of human history. And from that is born an entirely new political philosophy. From Rousseau, we get a very idiosyncratic understanding of democracy. And from Marx, we get communism. So Rousseau had said, do not listen to the philosophers, for they are liars. Listen to nature, which never lies. But then Rousseau proceeds to interpret this version of nature for us and to give his political philosophy based on that. And so I see Marx doing the same thing. And by the way, so did Locke and Hobbes, the two other social contract thinkers with Rousseau. They look to this idea of nature, interpret what they see, and then based off of that interpretation, which is really a very revisionist understanding of history, or not even history, because Rousseau even says, you know, this didn't really happen historically, but it is supposed to have happened. So it's highly theoretical. And then based on that, coming up with a new political philosophy, a new system. And that, in this first paragraph, is exactly what Marx does. He's rereading history. And then he, from that, is going to proceed with a new political philosophy. So any thoughts or questions, comments?
So I have a question. So my understanding is that Marx was mostly a Hegelian. How does that connect, like in his historical thinking, how does that connect to Rousseau? Because he kind of had that idea of like the story progressing. And my understanding is that he got that mostly from Hegel, or no?
Well, in the sense that he adopts this idea of thesis and antithesis. And so what Marx does is he puts forth the thesis, and then we'll have to go through this in more specific, so it's not so theoretical. But then he follows upon the thesis with antithesis and resolution. So the thesis is that the proletarians and the bourgeois, the two opposing classes, you have like the working class, and then you have the bourgeois overclass, the merchants, the, even artisans, the lords, depending on which of these two contrasts you're looking at. I mean, he starts off, if we look at the next paragraph, he gives this juxtaposition between the two classes in history. In ancient Rome, we have the patricians, knights, plebeians, slaves, the Middle Ages, feudal lords, vassals, guild masters, journeymen, apprentices, serfs, and so there's a juxtaposition between the oppressor class and the oppressed class. And the resolution comes through the antagonism, through like the class warfare. And then what Marx is ultimately leading to with the Communist Manifesto is that we are now in the stage of history where we have the proletarian class and we have the bourgeois class. This is the thesis and the antithesis. The class warfare is going to bring the two together, and then you end up with the resolution, which is a classless society. So that's the Hegelian element. But he brings in, there's others who have influenced his thinking. You know, I don't know if he read, I would assume he read Rousseau because he read the classics. He, you know, chatted at length with his father-in-law, who was well read. His dad knew Rousseau by heart. So I have to assume that he read Rousseau in his during his education. So there could have been, you know, just that romantic influence on his imagination. I think it's pretty clear, romantic enlightenment. But he did study Hegel. I mean, he's in Germany. He's at the University of Berlin at a time when Hegel only had recently stopped teaching there, but his students were alive and well. And so there's all these philosophical debates going on between the Hegelians of one brand and the Hegelians of another. And Marx certainly would have been privy to those debates. And Marx and Hegel did certainly influence Marx. But then he took, well, we won't get into more than that. Michael.
Yes. Help me understand something. How do you understand romanticism? I need to get a better handle on that.
So just briefly, the Romantic movement was this reaction to Enlightenment rationalism. And Enlightenment rationalism had really stressed the role of abstract reasoning and cold rationality at the expense of feeling, emotion, imagination. And so you had this reaction against that in the form of the Romantic movement. And you get these romantic artists and poets and writers who went to the other extreme and were really stressing the role of emotion and sentiment and feeling and the élan vital, this just like vital life force that needed to be unleashed and unchained. And Rousseau has both this idea in his literary writings and also in his political writings. And so he's, I think, just a quintessential romantic thinker to study for that reason. But you can see it in the art. We looked at that a little bit in the Rousseau course, where there's just like this melancholy. There's a dark side to the romantic imagination, because on the one hand, it has this very idealistic view of life and life's possibilities, and this fraternal brotherhood that if we could all just, feel and share together, we can arrive at. But then on the other hand, there's the real life that we're living that does not look anything like the ideal. And so then you get this swing into the melancholic despair. And so this like wild vacillation, you can really see it in the literature and the art. It was a very powerful movement. And I think together that romantic movement with the cold, calculating Enlightenment rationality, they kind of come together in Marx. And we'll see with like his economic theories, the Enlightenment side of things mixed with this romantic imagination about the world utterly transformed. All right, who had their hand up first? Anne, I think, and then Lucy.
Yeah, a quick question. So clearly he starts off this very aggressively with the class warfare. But he's writing from polar extremes, right? We've got freeman and slave and lord and serf. And so I'm kind of curious, how historically accurate is that? Was there not any class in between, or is that really what they were dealing with? Because usually there's something in between. It's not just typically two extremes, the very, very rich and then the very, very poor. So is this like kind of propaganda to kind of rile up emotions? Or, I mean, what was the realistic scenario, when it comes to this?
So one, yes, this is propaganda for sure, because this is putting out the Communist Manifesto. This is like their debut where they're trying to get their ideas and their platform out there. But at the same time, Marx, I think, is not trying to give a specific exact history. He says, oh, okay, there's further specific gradations within these different classes. But what he's trying to do is just set up the movement of history in kind of a sweeping manner so that people can see that, oh, yeah, there were the patricians and the plebeians and the slave class. And then that era of history did transition into a new one. And then you had the feudal lords. And so there's these parts that, yes, are historically accurate. These classes did exist in history. And we know that different epochs kind of transitioned into new epochs until we get to modernity. So he's taking these isolated facts of history, but he's presenting it as if it was class warfare and these kinds of revolutions that took place. And the key takeaway is that what he is saying is it's the material conditions that drove history. So that is key to Marx, his historical materialism. So historical materialism is the belief that the material conditions are the drivers of history. So for Marx, it's the way we buy and sell, the way we produce and consume goods. And that generates our material conditions of life, which in turn controls how we think, what our religious beliefs are, what our philosophical beliefs are. It's predetermined essentially by the material conditions within which you live, within the era that you live in. And so a change in those conditions, like moving from the patrician plebeian era to the next feudal lord and serf era, those two different epochs have different modes of thought and religious belief because of the way in which goods were exchanged, essentially, the mode of production. So that is Marx's unique contribution to the history of thought. And that's where he combines Hegel with this thesis and antithesis and somebody named Feuerbach, who had a theory on materialism. And Marx kind of synthesizes those two. And this is his presentation. And he presents it as if it is scientifically true. Lucy, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to kind of say what Anne was saying, something similar that, I think it's not true that people exist in these little boxes. I think there is a gradation all up and down the chain, even, to say like, oh, wealthy people. Well, there's a gradation in wealthy people, and oh, peasants, there's a gradation there. So I guess I think that Marx was presenting, it's like a solution looking for a problem. So he's developed his theory, and now he's going to shape the facts to make it work. That's what.
Yes, and actually, in that is a key to the problem of communism, which is that it has taken people and historical epochs and made it abstract. And so then you have to fit human beings into the predetermined categories. And that's where you get things like the killing quotas, that certain number of people need to be shot in order to fit the quota, which ties in directly to the theory. And so it's highly problematic when somebody says that, oh, this wasn't real communism, that's why it failed. Actually, no, it's always going to fail because that is communism. That is the theory. It is built into the theory, the killing quotas. Anthony.
Yeah, I was gonna say something similar to what Lucy was talking about. That it's seemed to be an answer in search of a question, and also just overall reading the Communist Manifesto again, it just overall it seems very shallow. I don't understand how people talk about how it's like, oh, so deep and meaningful, it changed my life, all that. It comes off so shallow when you break it down. To me, it just comes off as someone who has never built, engaged, or achieved at anything, deciding, hey, this is my theory, and since I'm so flippin' smart, and obviously I know better than all these people who've actually done things, here's what it is. Now I just have to hammer everybody over the head with it until they believe it. I just kept coming across these phrases, and where he would reiterate and restate something he'd said a couple paragraphs or a couple pages before, just in different language. And I was like, dude, it still doesn't make sense. You're still not providing any data. You're not showing your work. Like what?
Read his biography and you'll be even more shocked. But he does. The manifesto is very abstract. He does not substantiate claims. He makes broad, sweeping revisions of history, and he just kind of moves on, and he doesn't substantiate what he is claiming. And so it's very difficult to take it seriously, but we have to stop almost paragraph by paragraph and figure out what are the claims that he's making, because that is what has influenced communism so much. All right, Kevin.
Yeah, about the class, basically the class struggles, specifically with like the Middle Ages. I'm gonna attempt to push back a little bit about the whole gradations. From my understanding, I thought it was, kind of fairly cut and dry in like terms of classes. Where you got like the serfs are tied to the lands, and they're never, and their entire families are never going to be like become lords until the Black Death comes and wipes out 30% all of, like, what was it, 30% of Europe. And all of a sudden there's upward mobility. And so the idea of being able to move upwards in classes and the gradation of classes, from my understanding, really came about with the fall of the Middle Ages, the Enlightenment and mercantilism and like early modernity. Is that not the case? Or
Well, so I was quoting Marx here when he's going through this account of the epochs of history in the different
yeah,
classes. And
yeah,
he
and
just
I'm
he at the end there just says, and in almost all of these classes for their specific gradations. So I think that's just his shortcut of way of saying that, oh, there's more to it, but I'm not really gonna.
and I think broadly I'm kind of, especially with the Middle Ages bit, because that's what I'm kind of most familiar with as opposed to ancient Rome. I'm kind of in agreement, like, yeah, you got these cut and dry social classes. The issue, the real question is that a problem? I say no. He obviously says yes. Um,
Well, and
but
he's arguing that it was the conflict between the classes that brought about the revolution and
yeah, and
moved us to a new epoch, which I mean,
yeah,
is that the case? He doesn't substantiate it.
I would disagree with about that, but the fact that those classes exist and they're kind of hard and fast and kind of unchanging versus like gradations where like people can move in between some of the classes. I think that was a product of like early modernity more so than um what was kind of implied by I think Anna was the one who was initially brought it up. But yeah, so I'm kind of pushing back a little bit on what it sounded like what you all were saying.
Lisa.
I'll try to make this quick because I assume this is where you're going to be going. But my question is, if he's just summarily, abstractly, superficially revising all of history, why does it work? What is the power that it had on people's imagination? Was it tapping into something about culture that existed all around him? Or a feeling I had reading this for the first time is that he seems remarkably talented at tapping into the basest impulses in human nature. And that I can feel that even in the first paragraph. So, or is it both or more?
I mean, I have my theory, but it is a question. How could this man read the biography? How could this man have moved the world? So the revolution did not happen in Germany like he predicted. It happened in Russia, of all places, that did not have any of the material conditions that he described being the preconditions for a communist revolution. I mean, Russia was a backwater. It was a backwards country in Marx's estimation. That should have been the last place to see a communist revolution. I think there was a conspiracy involved among elites. The aristocrats played a prominent role, but I don't think that this Communist Manifesto and Marx's ideas were taken up at the grassroots. I mean, there was no grassroots revolution in Russia, and there was no grassroots revolution in France. So any history that tells you that is lying to you, to quote Rousseau.
So the answer is it didn't. It's not that this had such power to transform minds. There's
Well,
something else.
but I do think after the fact, the legacy of it has been very powerful because the ideas were, I think, conspiratorially implemented in Russia by a small group. I mean, Bolshevik literally means minority, and a very small and powerfully backed group of aristocrats and elites, who many of whom were not Russian, brought about the revolution in Russia. And then, I mean, there was all kinds of promises and hopes and dreams and the romantic imagination involved. And people were looking back to Marx like this kind of prophet. And so he actually assumed this new life and persona that he actually never really had when he was living. Um, and the text now, I think, means something very different than it did back when Marx wrote it. And it has kind of taken on a new life of its own. And people have a very impressionistic idea about it, a very hazy one. Not many people read the text. How many communists have read the text? And so there's something there where the imagination is influenced without actually, without it being moved on a rational level. Because rationally, this doesn't make sense. So there's something else there that has compelled the world of communists and the true believers. Let's see. Austin and Elise.
Yeah, sorry. So kind of going back to the historical materialism, there was someone I was talking to last week that was actually trying to pitch me on that. And there was a couple things that I was kind of wondering about. One was I pushed back and I was like, what would be the difference between man and animal because it seems to reduce man just down to material needs. And the response was there is no difference. But I guess I'm kind of trying to see how it all fits together, especially keeping in mind this Hegelian way of thinking of history. How can you kind of hold that everything is determined by material need, and also have this, like there is seeing that there's a direct progression of history, and Marx is even using that in that first sentence. How can you hold both materialism and determinism, and what's guiding, if everything is material, what do Marxist theorists hold as the guide to this determination? And I'm trying to resolve materialism and determinism, I guess.
What do you mean? What do you mean? What do they hold as the guide? Like, where does he find his evidence for it? Or
well, I mean, like for us, like we think of God as an author of history or something, but if this is all materialism, I don't understand how they can have a view that things are progressing and it's determined, and like everything that we do is determined by material. And
right.
yet,
So why does history have a telos?
yes.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? I mean, uh, there is something, there's faith involved, belief in things unseen. Because why should history be moving toward any end? Marx reads that into history up until, he is right, up until modernity. But I don't know that Marx, he would say that that history itself is evidence that it's moving in this direction toward communism, and that he's just the prophet who has come to read that in. I don't know that they would be able to give any explanation. He certainly wouldn't say that it's because of God. I think he would just say that historical accident produced things to go probably astray, because I think he has this Rousseauian understanding of nature and what is natural. The class conflict and the oppression versus oppressor is an aberration from what should be. And so there is this normative claim that is behind his idea that we should be going to the place where he writes this in the German ideology, where in the morning you can hunt, and in the afternoon you can fish, that famous line by Marx where he thinks communism should be leading. I mean, it is something that is difficult for, I think, the Marxists to square. Because you're right, why should there be a telos of history? Why should we be moving to that dreamy end?
So it's just merely just an induction that they've made, seeing how history's gone.
I think so, and I think it's been influenced by this Hegelian understanding of thesis and antithesis resolving. And so for Hegel, it resolves in like the world spirit, or however he couches it. Whereas for Marx, it resolves in a new material condition in which we don't really have to work, which, I mean, it's not hard to see how this came out of Marx's own personal fantasy, because he really didn't work a day in his life hardly. I mean, he had a few publications in newspapers, but like his family was destitute. They were desperately poor. One of his children died of tuberculosis from the poor living conditions. He really did not want to have to earn money. And so I don't think it's a stretch to say that his philosophy was heavily influenced by his own personal circumstances and what motivated him as a person.
I guess it also makes sense too if you like are thinking that history you can see in the past, oh, these are material conditions. This is what made this next historical event happen, all these material conditions. Then based on that, he maybe thinks, well, I see material conditions right now, so then I can predict what the next historical event is that's going to happen.
Yeah, I think that's what he's doing. And I think that's what can be compelling about his theory is, well, he points to some realities that are true, especially, when he talks about the alienation of man and the condition of the working classes. I mean, it's hard not to see that, yeah, there's a real problem going on when there's 8-year-olds who are working in the mills. But we have to look at his philosophy and see what he's proposing, and really to look carefully at what he writes. Who had their hand? Go ahead, Anthony.
Yeah, I was just going to kind of pick up on what Lisa was talking about of, why he's, I guess, had staying power and had so much influence. And I think, especially what we've talked about so far, I think it's not so much the ideas or even the ideals that he put down in the Communist Manifesto. I think a lot of it comes down to he's the one that distilled and codified the language that's used. And since he is so abstract with it, that language can be applied to any essentially grievance that you want to focus on. So he essentially wrote the playbook and gave everybody the talking points to apply, that Lenin took and applied, that are being applied now in a lot of cultural areas, all of that. So I don't think it's so much his ideas, whether it be economic or societal or whatever. I think it's just the fact that he was the first one to really put down, this is how you describe it, this is how you talk about it. And for whatever reason, he was able to do it in a way that still gets across to people. It still hits those base instincts. And even if you don't fully understand what it is he's talking about or what it is, you get the sense of it. It's almost like a song without lyrics. You can feel the rhythm to it, even if you don't know the lyrics to it. I think that's his real impact, and I think that's why he's had so much staying power, and everybody just refers back to him. And it's like, oh yeah, it's what Marx said, and everybody's like, oh yeah, Marx, big deal. So that's what Marx said. But I think that's at least part of why he's been so influential and what his actual impact is.
That's a great way of putting it. You can feel the urgency and that he's like building up to this pitch. But the abstract language is like this carte blanche for anybody to kind of insert what they think it should mean and how it should be applied, which is why it was so dangerous and why it was applied, in these ways that were just insane and so violent. Yeah, Sharyar, you're next.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that my reading might be incorrect, but I found him to be a really good writer, and I didn't want to, I didn't think I would agree with him on so much, but just reading him, I found his use of religious arguments very compelling. how he would say that the professions are becoming secularized. The doctor is not seen as, something sacred. Everything is just about money, and like even the relationship between the family is all monetary. How much is, someone getting you? And I found his rhetoric to be, like to be much better than I expected. And I know he doesn't believe in these things, but he is speaking the language of the people in my estimation. And so that was, and also how the production is becoming a god itself. How even the bourgeoisie don't have a control over the means, the production that's just it's production for production's sake. Almost that we can see it now in our times. Instead, like I'm surprised you can see it from back then, but we have like instead of the best for the people, we're looking for what's the most productive way of making more money. And you can see in China as well now, where it's just gross. It's just massive scale of industry. Yeah, those are my thoughts on the readings.
Yeah, I think you're right. And, I said this about Rousseau. This person needs to be taken very seriously. At the top of, in my edition anyways, page 66, but you could just listen. I'll read this out. The cheap prices of its commodities, this is the bourgeoisie, are the heavy artillery with which it batters down all Chinese walls, with which it forces the barbarians' most entrenched hatred of foreigners to capitulate. It compels all nations, if they are not to be overwhelmed, to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. It compels them to introduce what it calls civilization into their midst, i.e., to become bourgeois themselves. In a word, it creates a world after its own image. And so, there is something compelling about this, and it does ring true. Like, you look at all the cheap bric-a-brac you can get off of Amazon the next day from China, stuff we don't need, stuff that, is foisted upon us as things we should be wanting and desiring. And he talks about this problem of overproduction. And yeah, parts of it you think, well, he's making a point here, especially when you read something like this. And so there is something compelling about that, I think, and something prescient, that the reduction of human relationships to just the cash nexus, you can see that. Yeah, that's a good point. Who had their hand up next? Was it Barbara or Kelly?
I don't know.
We'll go with you, Kelly.
Okay. Asking for clarification, when you were talking about the fact that you have the bourgeoisie and the proletariat as the thesis, and then you have the class revolution that's going to resolve, what's the antithesis in
Well,
that?
my understanding of it is that it's the maybe it's the two theses that resolve in the antithesis, and the antithesis is once you have moved into the next epoch and there's a new mode of production. And so the class warfare is what then brings you to the next antithesis, which then becomes a thesis. And you've got this like Hegelian cycle that I too get lost in.
Yeah, I know, and I think that he's not exactly Hegelian. He takes that sense of sort of spiraling forward towards something as opposed to history, consummation of history in a biblical way. But I think it's just I'm trying to get my head around where you have the thesis, but what's the agitator that gets the class revolution going? What's the spark that gets the revolution?
Well, it's interesting because Marx, up until this point, it all just kind of unfolded naturally. It unfolded of itself in history, and these epochs just moved in one to the next. And so I think he uses the term contradictions. I know he uses that term with regard to the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, and he talks about the internal contradictions of capitalism, how that will bring about the demise of capitalism, and this problem of overproduction. And then you won't have enough consumers, and then the proletariat class will realize its own misery when it has been reduced to just penury. And so that realization, it'll create this class consciousness, according to Marx.
Yeah.
And they will then start the revolution.
Okay.
Which
The
is
class
different than his
consciousness.
reading. I mean, that's not how he reads
I
prior
know. Yeah.
epochs because there wasn't the kind of revolution that he's envisioning. But he thinks that this is going to be, I mean, the final battle between good and evil that's going to bring about the communist utopia.
Yeah. It's just trying to get my head around it because it doesn't fit neatly.
I know.
You know, yeah, it's kind of,
It is a challenge.
yeah, I mean, because I understand the whole class consciousness I mean, this is, you know, that's the whole woke movement. And I was good at it at one time. But and I have one other question is when you were talking about the historical materialism, where it's basically the material conditions in which you live. Kind of, it reminds me like an epistemological epoch. You know what you know, and you can only know what you know because of the time in which you live. But you also said that it's the drivers of history, but you also talked about it something about the individual or meaning or something like that about that that the material conditions not just drove history, but they impacted the individual.
Yeah, I mean, so Marx he has the base and the superstructure.
Right.
And the
Yeah.
base is the material conditions. That's the mode of
Okay.
exchange, the mode of production. And then he says that that determines the superstructure. And within the superstructure, I mean, you have religious beliefs, you have personal philosophies, you have just anything that the form of government, anything that encompasses social relations is all determined by that mode of production.
Thank you.
Barbara.
Yes. I just in terms of like why it caught on, and I'm reiterating what other people have said too, but there's a saying that a heresy is the revenge of a forgotten truth. And because of original sin, I mean, there is just so much suffering and exploitation of people. And so it seems like he's given you an answer to sort of get this, especially an atheistic answer to getting this all straightened out.
Yeah, I mean, he is coming up with this theory of materialism to give us really what's an easy solution to the problem he's done away with in original sin, which is like Rousseau and many other thinkers, that we can actually solve what have heretofore been intractable social and political problems through structural changes in society. And so for Rousseau, it was changing the form of government to make it based on nature, which he explained what nature was. And then for Marx, I mean, he is doing essentially a similar thing in saying that there's a structural answer to our spiritual problem. We don't have to contend with original sin and with the difficult work of reforming ourselves that entails in the Christian religion. We can reform first, kind of, there's going to be governmental changes where the revolution takes place, but that all ties into this structural change of the economic mode of production changing. And having a revolution is easier than contending with the permanent problem of sin. And I think that's also why this is so alluring.
Yeah.
Any other comments or questions?
I'll just make a quick comment if that's okay.
Yeah.
So when I was in college, and of course, I think the first thing I read, we read the Communist Manifesto right by Gramsci's Prison Notebooks. So we sort of went kind of deep into critical theory pretty fast. But I remember personally, once I got into a lot of the feminist texts, uh, this concept that you could totally fix your life and be completely free of the spiritual sin problem was the most allegedly liberating, empowering force that any of us could. I mean, it was like, I've never heard this. You mean I actually don't have to live within these boundaries and I'm going to be like liberated and happy? And it's so compelling. I think, like going back to say the heresy is the revenge of the forgotten truth. But I think just kind of having experienced that, obviously, 100 years later, but it's really, really powerful. And, I was raised in a Christian home, but then, I knew that in order for me to be a feminist, I had to be an atheist, because you can't be a theist and a feminist, period, at least in my opinion. But I thought I just wanted to comment how incredibly powerful and seductive that idea is, that we can march and get political and we can be activists and we're going to fix it all. It's just really, really, really scarily seductive.
It is. And I think that Marx's poetry, the two ballads that I mentioned, are his full-blown artistic meditation on that very theme of what happens when you step outside of the bounds of what has been prescribed by Christianity, and you step outside of the norms, and of God's law. And those poems, I mean, you wind up with the diabolical, which is where his politics led to. Stephen.
Hi, sorry. You had mentioned earlier the like the base and the superstructure, the base being the material conditions or the mode of production. Just so I understand it clearly, what's sort of the difference between the two, or are they the same thing?
Between the base and the superstructure?
Between the mode of production and the material conditions.
Oh, same thing. The mode of production is pretty much the way in which the goods and services are exchanged. So in Marx's revision of history, I mean, he sees in each of these epochs a different mode of exchange. It was dominated by a different economic system. And so that economic system created the material conditions that determined patterns of thought, essentially, Marx would say. I mean, everything.
I see. Okay. Okay, got it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Claudia.
Sorry. So I think what I found so fascinating about the manifesto is connecting the past and the present that we're now, and how you see all the seeds of like the Romantic, Hegel, the Malthusians, because if I'm not mistaken, Saint-Simon was one of the Malthusian socialists. So he believed that like wages had to be kept low so people wouldn't have children, basically. So the seeds of feminism, in a part here, he talks about the national differences. So multiculturalism, the consumerism. So I think it's so interesting to see how all the romantics and their sexual revolution and their naturalism and all those things kind of connect in this one document that kind of brings all the everything that we see now separated into a bunch, kind of like a hydra or whatever other mythological creature you want, that every time you cut a head, a new one comes out and everything is here. It's fascinating, really, to see all of that together. And there is a seduction in the structure was very rigid before that, but not so all the moral imagination that the romantics planted, all these changes, you kind of can see them all here. And now we are kind of seeing all those things coming in fruition. And this was I think what was most fascinating to me. And the second thing, in the book you recommended us for reading, talking about the religious aspect, there's a part where he talks about the confession of faith and a catechism. And I think it's so interesting that he uses those words. So you can see, I think it's so interesting that you see like this clear Gnostic secular religion coming up, it's fascinating, really.
Yeah, great points. Anyone else have any comments, questions? Yeah, I mean, that's the communist governments are totalitarian because if material conditions determine everything about human existence, government, religion, the nature of the family, all of it, I mean, it's all then held within the political. And that's why communist governments have to be totalitarian, I mean, by nature, because it's all bound together. And so these productive forces for Marx are the sole driving forces of history. Something that is interesting about this is the creative destruction that Marx discusses of bourgeois capitalism. He talks about how it uproots traditional social life, drowns out religious sentiment. I think this was maybe the passage that Sharyar had brought up. And this reduction of all of life to the cash nexus. And then wherever this force of capitalism, bourgeois capitalism goes, it basically converts the souls there, Marx says. And I mean, there's something interesting there, and you can kind of see that, I would argue, with American involvement in the Middle East. I mean, the neoconservative foreign policy crew that was behind a lot of that made that very argument that it would be a good thing, actually, for the creative destruction of capitalism to go and to harness the destructive power of capitalism in the Middle East to get rid of those backward ways, and as a way of bringing in Western style democracy. I mean, it's interesting because communism essentially does the same thing. I mean, obviously it was imperialistic, but there's some interesting connection there, I think, with this idea of creative destruction. I don't know if that struck anyone else.
Well, he does refer to, when I was reading it, globalism there. He doesn't use the term globalism, but it's certainly there. This whole idea of the capitalist expansion, the making of profit, making of money is the most important thing. It drives everything. Looking for cheap labor, exploiting labor. Isn't that what's being done in China in a sense? So, some of his points were, if you aren't wrong, capitalism isn't an innocent philosophy. It can, now obviously it's better than in communism or socialism, but it has its problems if not properly harnessed. It goes hand in hand with liberalism as a philosophy. And I don't mean liberalism as a Democratic Party platform where big government, I mean the liberalism that sprung out of Hobbes and Locke. And getting back to this whole thing on materialism, just very quickly, materialism isn't just about the material factors that affect the society. It has to do with the nature of the human person. His starting point in understanding the human person is in error, like it was for Rousseau and Hobbes and Locke. But the human person is just mute, dumb stuff. There's no such thing as human nature. There's no telos built into the human person. And that's why determinism can be, under his philosophy, it can be effective. If I don't have a human nature, then I'm necessarily going to be affected by external factors, necessarily. And therefore the human person can be molded. Not that environment can't affect you, certainly can. But under his understanding of the human person, you're necessarily affected by it. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And I probably should have mentioned that actually, and this ties back to what Austin had brought up about the telos of history. I mean, Marx takes this kind of Hobbesian view. Hobbes argues that man is just a machine and that God was the watchmaker who put it all together and wound it up, and then off we went. And we're just like bumping atoms together. And so the material world, it impacts everything, exactly like you said, how we think and what we do. And there's no room for the spiritual or the divine in this materialistic universe. Yeah, you're exactly right. So I don't know, Austin, does that answer why history is moving toward the telos? I think that the materialist explanation is just that, the chain has been set off once the watch is wound up.
Yeah, I definitely, especially just thinking of man as a machine or being affected by external circumstances does answer a lot because, yeah, like Michael was saying, I think it's a misunderstanding of human nature and kind of simplifying and just, it's like we can explain everything about humans and their actions just by sociology. I don't know. It seems that I feel like just so many philosophers have tried to achieve that. It's like if it's some sort of alchemy. If we could just figure out the human person, like we can, I don't know, we can solve all of our social problems. And it seems too good to be true because I think it is too good to be true.
Yeah. Anthony.
Yeah, I think picking up on what Michael was talking about and what you were talking about and the adventurism in the Middle East, I think Michael is right that whether it's capitalism, communism, liberalism, whatever, taken to the extremes, or more importantly, when instead of viewing that philosophy as just one aspect or one way to understand society or one way to explain parts of society or an economy, when you decide that, in this case, like communism is the overall answer for all of it, like communism is what unlocks all of society, or capitalism is what is just the base foundational principle that rules and runs the world, and there we go, we've got it. When you try to apply those systems or that philosophy to everything, that's where you see the breakdown and the crossover. Because yes, capitalism is great in that it provides, a lot of mobility, lateral, upwards, all of that. It provides a lot of freedom for innovation, all that. But if it's just capitalism, yes, you end up with 8-year-olds working 18 hours a day in a sweatshop for, a crusty end of bread. In the same way with communism, if you're like, okay, here's what it is. We rise up and we have to make sure that everything is shared equally amongst everyone. Well, then no one's going above and beyond. So yeah, I think it's when you decide that you have the answer and now you're just going to force it on every question out there. That's where you run into the issue. And I think you made a great point. The quagmire in the Middle East is a perfect example of, even with good intentions, seeing that taken to an extreme and just the folly that comes about from it.
Claudia.
So I think it's very interesting what Anthony said. And I think one of the things I've been asking myself, and I would love to hear all of you, is like Marx is comparing what he named capitalism happening in real time to what he thought communism would be. And I think now that we have several examples of capitalism in reality and communism in reality, we are not we can compare them together. So like, okay, yes, having an 8-year-old is working in a factory is awful. And we as capitalists, we don't do that anymore, right? But communism still starved children, starved millions, billions of children. So I think I think this is very interesting all when we're talking in this time and period, but what is kind of puzzling to me is how now in the year of 2025, people are still communists, because you can compare like what, in which society would you rather live in reality? And I know communists will tell you, okay, but this is not really communism. It was not the real deal. But we are still comparing two realities now, instead of in that time that we were comparing like theory versus reality.
Yeah, exactly. So why is it so compelling still in the face of evident and apparent repeated failures? Yeah, that's something we're going to talk about this whole class. Stephen.
I had a question. How does Marx have an account of sort of the origins of how the class struggle comes about, like in the first society, for like, for example, in Hobbes or Locke, you have to sort of leave the state of nature, and everything is sort of motivated by like a fear of death or something. Does he have an account of like where the class struggle sort of originates from?
I mean, he mentions the contradictions of capitalism, and he gives kind of this sort of sweeping account of how the overproduction is going to drive about these historical changes where the class consciousness will arise finally among the proletariat that up to that point had not been aware of themselves as being a united class. And so once the conditions become so bad, they will then have this consciousness of themselves as an oppressed class, and they will realize that the bourgeoisie is their enemy and oppressor. And then the revolution will happen, is my reading of how Marx answers that.
I see. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Anybody else want to add to that? Kevin?
Well, I had an answer to your question about like, why does this keep coming back up? We've seen countless examples of it being just terrible, but it keeps coming back up. And I think the answer really it's really quite simple. We want a utopia. And this is an atheistic utopia. Us Catholics have a utopia. It's called heaven. We're going to hopefully get it after we die. So it's not going to be something, here on this earth that we can achieve ourselves. But an atheist can't have that because they don't have a God, they don't have an afterlife or anything like that per their philosophy. So they're trying to do it here on Earth, fallen world, but the allure of utopia is kind of like built into man. So to me, that's why it keeps kind of coming back despite all of the history. You look at Cuba, you look at the USSR, you look at all the North Korea, you look at all of the examples, and it's like, but it keeps coming back because we have this innate desire for utopian paradise.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree with that.
I think that and kind of the lack of morality that allows you to do what's necessary when you have this vague, proletariat that's 4 billion people, it's kind of the ends justify the means. And I think that's very seductive for a lot of people, that you're not constrained by, turn the other cheek when the shopkeeper or the factory owner is employing 8-year-olds. you go to his house and put his head on a pitchfork, and everyone can kind of rally behind that if there's no sense of God or morality.
Yeah, and I'm convinced that's why the Bolsheviks were so powerful, because they were willing to do anything. I mean, there was no limit.
I wanted to add, I think it's ironic that the need, or the visualized need for communism, stemmed from human corruption, and the misgivings and failures of communism stemmed from human corruption. And it's almost like, instead of focusing on new political philosophies, if Karl Marx would have focused on a group, a religious group, or a self-transformative group that focused on growth of the human soul and becoming a better person and rooting out corruption and sin, that if we each did that on a daily basis, that over time society would on its own become better, and there wouldn't be a need for these new political systems, because I don't believe that any political system can ever work if there's human corruption at the top level, and there's no government mandate or political philosophy that's going to change or root out corruption without a true purpose to change who we are as people and grow our souls.
Yeah, but
Just, spent a little more time helping his own family and maybe attending his father's funeral, the world would be a better place. Less philosophizing. Anthony.
yeah, I think Matt's onto something, and I think probably the big hangup is for that to happen, Marx and people like him would actually have to have just a little bit of humility and be able to look in the mirror and go, hey, maybe I should start right here, instead of just assuming I've got everything laid out. Let me tell you how it goes. Especially with what you've said about his biography and life. Good Lord. But yeah, I think Matt's onto something though. That is the blind spot where a lot of this comes from, is instead of people looking internally. And I think that's part of the lack of the spiritual. Instead of looking internally and starting there, they just automatically assume, hey, I should be over here and I'm not. Let me find out why. Okay, here we go. This is why. And let's move forward. But yeah, just that lack of humility and morality.
Isn't it kind of an antithesis of like kind of how we view things, where we would say human nature is broken in some way. We have a fallen nature, but they would say no, like humans are fine, like, but what's broken is society, and if only society could be fixed, then humans would, like, we would be able to be liberated. But yeah, it fails to recognize like there is, yeah, something broken about us, and like maybe it's not society that needs to be fixed, but human nature
Yeah,
itself.
I think that, and that's the difference between the old Christian worldview and then the modern Enlightenment and Romantic worldview that still persists. It's like if we just rearrange things and structure society in a certain way, we can get around the problem of sin and around the problem of having to do that difficult work on ourselves.
I was gonna say, with the existentialist said, hell is other people, where a Christian would just put up a mirror and look into it, and that's where they'd start.
As an introvert, though, sometimes you can sympathize with Sartre.
Yeah.
I think it was Sartre who said that.
If you were part of the Marx family, yeah, I could see that.
What I was going to say is that really sounds like the modern progressive thought, progressive philosophy, that we can just regulate ourselves to nirvana here on earth. If we just make enough regulations, let's make a law against bullying. That'll fix everything. If we just have a law against bullying, then nobody will ever bully anybody, and it'll be great. So it's like, just, yes, instead of looking at yourself and saying, well, maybe I shouldn't bully people, or that's not a Christian thing to do, that we'll just make enough laws, we'll make enough regulations, and then we'll have nirvana here. So
I think we're about at time. This was a great class, good discussion. I hope you all enjoyed it. So I have my syllabus here. Next time, we'll just continue going through the rest. It's not long, but there's a few more pages. We can look at a couple more passages, and I think that as we do that, it really, gets it a lot. And then I had assigned Hunt's book, the chapter. He has a great book, The Theory and Practice of Communism, an introduction. It's out of print. It was hard to find, but this is a good, it's good. So this chapter, only 10 pages, Marx's theory of the state and revolution. So then we can get into a discussion on this idea of revolution and how it's connected with communism and with Marx's theory. Well, thank you all. Thank you all for a good class, and I'll hopefully see you all in a week.